Hey folks, this is JJ Chalupnik, and I'm here to teach you a small tutorial, hopefully not wasting too much of your time, on how to do Maya depth maps with Mental Ray. Now, if you've worked in Maya before, you may have noticed that sometimes getting depth maps out of Maya can be a pain. I'm hoping that this tutorial will help simplify that process and make it easier to jump in and out of Maya when you need depth passes. So here in my scene, I've got a very simple scene. It's just a plane with some spheres, some chrome materials, and a couple Lamberts, and a camera that has a little bit of range for depth of field. Now there's a few things that you should set up first or know before you jump into creating a depth pass. Number one, you should have your HUD available up here so that you can see the distance from camera available in the unit scale that you're using up here in the top right hand corner. In order to turn that on, you go to Display, Heads Up Display, Object Details. I pretty much like to have Object Details and Polycount on almost all the time when I'm working inside Maya. The only time I turn these off typically is when I'm rendering out a play blast. That way you can always have a good sense of what your scene is doing at any given moment, and it's great for diagnostics and figuring out if you're getting bloated or whatever. So once you've got that set up, it's important to also know what your unit scale is. So under Maya Preferences, you can go to Settings, and you can define what unit scale you want to work in at that given time. In this case, right now I'm working in centimeters. So if I change this to inches, for example, you'll see that the distance from the camera updates. It's important to know the unit scale so that you can adjust your depth values appropriately to match whatever scale you're working in. We'll stay in centimeters for now. So now that you've got your HUD display up and you've got your scene set up and you're ready to start rendering depth passes, the next phase is to choose what type of depth pass to use, what type of method. And this method in particular I found to be extremely flexible, and it allows you to make adjustments quickly in the viewport on the fly. I haven't tested this in previous versions of Maya. This is Maya 2015. So it may not work as well on previous versions, but it's definitely a really nice thing that Viewport 2.0 can do, and so I highly recommend trying it this way. I would also say that despite the real-time feedback that you get, it's still probably the best method to approach rendering depth passes. So first thing you need to do is select the geometry that is in your scene. An easy way to do that is go to the outliner and select Show Objects and just show geometry, and that way you can just select the scene geometry and not have to worry so much about anything else. And then go to your channel box, and in the channel box go to the Render tab, create a new empty layer or create a new layer and assign selected objects, and in this new layer we're going to name it Depth. So now if you switch between these two, you'll notice only the objects you selected are now inside this depth layer. And this is important because it keeps this scene simplified. You don't want to add any lights or anything like that because it'll unnecessarily increase your render time. So with all your objects now in your scene, you'll go ahead and select this depth and you'll right click, go to Attributes, and it'll open up the attribute editor where it will show the depth pass render layer information, and you can click on Presets, Luminance Depth. And what this does is it assigns a luminance shader on every object in your scene that is essentially connected to the camera. So to get an idea of what that's doing, you can look at your hypershade and you can see the surface shader, and the sampler info node will basically gather a range, an old min and an old max, and that range will be used to determine whether or not you want the objects close to camera to be white or black. And that is what will give you your map when you go to composite. So the next step is to select the surface shader out of the hypershade, go into its input, and you'll find these two variables, old min and old max. These are the variables that you'll be adjusting. You do not need to mess with the value variable. You can leave this connected. But for these, you're going to right click inside the dialog, break connection, right click, break connection. And now with this selected, you can actually add the values that you want. So if you know that this is 61 inches from the camera or centimeters or whatever it is, you can then go to that surface shader and change the maximum to that value. And if you don't notice anything changing in here, it's probably because you haven't pressed 6 on the keyboard. So make sure that you press 6 to map your shaders and show them inside of the viewport live. It's very, very convenient. So if I just continue to change the old max, let's make it 150. You can see I'm getting a very nice gradation from light to dark, and it's automatically updating with my camera. It's an extremely nice way to approach depth passes. So if you go to this depth camera, you can basically dial in exactly the values you want. If you want a nice consistent range of tone between the shapes and everything, you'll just basically dial it in until the furthest object in your scene that you want to make, want to have focus on has a darker value. The closer these values are together, the less separated they are in your composite. So if you make this about, 85, that should probably be pretty good. So now if we test render this using Mental Ray, we should get a very good interpretation of our depth pass. Now, the depth pass doesn't necessarily need to contain alpha, but it can. Typically, I turn it off, and this actually comes up with a good point. If you may not be able to see it on your screen, but in mine, you can see this subtle bit of this HDR that I've got going on in the actual render. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove that, so that way all that you see is this depth pass. So the nice thing about using these render layers is you can create layer overrides for them. To give you a good idea of how that's going to work, we're going to go ahead and create one now for that backdrop. So if we show all, we can find our Mental Ray IBL, the image-based lighting that's being used, and we can find the render stats inside the shape node. Primary visibility is the one we want, and since Maya is kind of strange, even if you didn't select it, it still likes to think that it's there because it's a light, I guess, or it's a rendering object. For whatever reason, there's a disconnect. In order to prevent this from happening, you just right-click, create layer override, and uncheck it. So now, when you go back, your master layer should still work correctly, and it should have that, but your depth pass layer should not. So now if we go and we render again, you'll notice we have a nice clean depth pass. I'm now going to show you another fun trick that you can use when rendering the passes inside of a Mental Ray. In the render settings, you can see the render layer up here, and you can see which layers you're working with. You can also see that you've told it to use a layer override so that it's using Mental Ray and not Maya software. And you can identify these passes by using what's called render tokens. Render tokens are essentially identifiers that reference basically a placeholder to tell it to be something else. So when you're rendering stuff, instead of rendering it to the images folder inside your project and having to organize them afterwards, you can have them organize themselves by using a render token. We know that we want to use the depth layer, so we're going to create a new folder called render layer with a /. And if you click enter, you'll notice up in our file name it created an images folder, and then inside that images folder is a depth folder, and inside of that folder is a depth test.exr. I prefer to use EXRs. They're an open exchange format. They're very good for containing a lot of wonderful things. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial, but EXRs are very good file format that can do quite a bit. And maybe in another tutorial I will cover that a little bit more in depth. So another thing you can do, because this is a variable render layer, that means any layer that you have built up in your channel box can then become essentially that name. So you can have depth, ambient occlusion, anything you want inside of these render settings. It's pretty convenient. So if you go depth test _ render layer, and case is important here, so make sure you get the case correct, and the brackets, and then hit enter again, you should see it update depth test _ depth. And then you can have another one for Master Beauty if you are so inclined. So now we will batch render this file, and we will see what happens when we get both the master layer and the depth pass all in one go. Okay, and we're back. So if you take a look at our folder where the project is located, you will notice that we now have a master layer folder and a depth folder. And if you take a look at our EXRs, we have one here and we have one here. Now they look a little washed out because EXRs are linear format files. So it's important to understand color space and how that functions into your renders. This is way beyond the scope of this tutorial, but I highly recommend anybody who's learning 3D to understand linear workflow, because it's kind of crucial to getting renders to match your footage and to create solid composites and give you a lot of range when you're color correcting and doing things like that. So we'll take these two passes into After Effects and go ahead and start a new composition. And in that composition, you're going to put both the color pass as well as the depth pass. One other thing to note, when you're bringing files into Adobe After Effects, make sure you do a few things, like make sure that your settings down here, if you hold down the Alt key and click, you can change it to 16 or 32-bit. Now, After Effects will not recognize a 16-bit file as a floating point, but the nice thing about EXRs is that they are 32-bit files held together in a 16-bit structure. So you can get all the data of a 32-bit file with roughly half the file size. Now, it's not 100% accurate, but it does save you a lot on file space and still give you quite a bit of flexibility. But because After Effects can't recognize 16-bit half float values, you have to set After Effects' project to 32-bit in order to get the benefits of a 16-bit half EXR. For more information on this, do some research on EXRs and check some of the links below. So make sure that when you're doing this, to change it to 32-bit to get the full effect of the highlights, and I'll show you more about that in a second. So you don't need to have the depth map turned on, but it is important to have it in your timeline. And in this case, I'm going to ignore the alpha channel on the master layer. Now, I've personally found that the best plugin to use for creating camera depth in post in After Effects is Frischluft's Depth of Field. So if I go to Effect and you find Frischluft, it's a plugin called Lens Care, and you can download it from their website. It's a really fantastic plugin, and essentially it lets you build everything you would need to do depth of field in post, and it works pretty darn nicely. So you go ahead and select the depth layer as your depth of field selector, and you can use the select depth tool here to basically pinpoint exactly where you want the focus to be, and then you go ahead and blow it up, and you'll see some nice fall off between everything, and it gives you some very nice control over your depth in your image. And you can really crank this thing up too. And the higher you go, you'll start to notice things break down, but it delivers a very good result for a post blur. If you were to do this inside of a 3D program, chances are you would suffer greatly from extremely bad render times. Now, just a note on 16-bit versus 32-bit. If you look at your project settings and you change this back to 8-bit, you'll notice you lose a lot of information in these highlights. And if you know anything about cameras, typically highlights that get blown out, they don't disappear when you go out of focus. 16-bit helps a tiny bit, but again, those white values are much brighter than a typical 0:1 ratio or even a 16-bit ratio. So you have to go to 32 to really see them pop and continue to use them as you would if this was a film camera. That's pretty much it. You can render out your sequences and you can create all sorts of fun stuff using this technique. I highly recommend giving it a shot, and definitely look into that plugin because it's by far the best I've seen thus far. It can do this kind of work. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial.